You know, when you live long enough to see 12 major market collapses up close, you stop being impressed by clever forecasts and you start respecting very simple, very old-fashioned truths about human nature and money. Let me tell you my story that way, because every so-called signal people want from me is really just the same handful of lessons, repeating over 90 plus years in different costumes. I remember being a kid during the Great Depression, walking past grown men who were completely broken, not by a few bad quarters, but by leverage and overconfidence they never really understood. You know what hits a child. It's not the numbers in the newspapers. It's the look in a man's eyes when he realizes the game really is over and he has nothing left for his family. Long before I knew what a balance sheet was, I had already decided, whatever I do in life, I'm not going to be that guy who blows himself up because he can't stand to be a little poorer on the way up. You know what's funny? People think someone like me must have some mystical ability to call crashes. Let me tell you something very clearly. I've never made my money by predicting the timing of collapses. I made it by refusing to join the worst forms of madness when everyone else was enjoying them. You lived through 1929, the inflation of the 1970 seconds, the dot-com circus, the subprime carnival, and you notice the same script. People convince themselves that this time human greed, fear, and stupidity have all been repealed by some new technology or central bank magic wand. I remembered the late 1990 seconds very vividly. You know how many bright young people marched into our office and told us we were dinosaurs because we weren't buying companies with no profits, no cash, and business plans written in a fog of buzzwords. A lot. Let me ask you, if your entire valuation rests on the idea that someone even more excited than you will buy it at a higher price, is that investing or just a more respectable form of chain letter? We simply said no, sat there, looked stupid for a while, and then watched the air go out of the balloon, as it always does. You know what the crowd always underestimates. How long you can look wrong and still end up being right, as long as you stay solvent and sensible. I remember sitting there in 1999, thinking, well, we're not going to win any popularity contests, but we'll still have our capital after this is over. That's really the whole game. Don't die when others are making temporary fortunes on things they don't understand. Let me tell you about leverage, because that's the villain that shows up in almost every catastrophe I've seen. You know, it's not the mildly greedy people who cause the spectacular wrecks. It's the very clever people who pile debt on top of speculation and then act surprised when gravity still exists. I remember banks, funds, and assorted geniuses who thought a few extra turns of leverage were just good capital efficiency. It looks like genius right up until someone yanks the liquidity away, and then it looks like bankruptcy court. You know what normal people never fully grasp? How fast things happen once the tide turns. I've seen markets take years to climb the last silly 20% and then erase that plus another 50% in a few months. There's no polite warning bell. There's just a point where confidence flips and every leveraged optimist turns into a forced seller at the same time. That's when you discover who actually owned their assets outright and who was just renting them from their broker. I remember people in 2006 and 2007, very smooth, very sure of themselves, explaining to us that housing prices couldn't fall nationally because, well, they hadn't done so in the particular data window they liked to quote. You know what they actually meant. We've never seen the disaster we're setting ourselves up for. therefore it can't happen. That's not analysis. That's a failure of imagination combined with a paycheck that depends on not imagining too much. You know how I actually think about signals before a big break. Not as some magic indicator on a chart, but as a pattern in behavior and language. I listen for how people talk about risk, about debt, about easy money, and about those rare folks who refuse to play along. When everyone who is cautious is being ridiculed as out of touch, you're closer to an accident than you think. Let me tell you, I've watched over and over as markets transform from places where people carefully buy pieces of real businesses into casinos where they bet on ticker symbols detached from any underlying reality. In those late stages, you hear phrases like new era, this time is different, and you just don't get it, thrown at anyone who insists that cash flow actually matters. That's not a new signal. That's the same old siren song in a new key. I remember when we bought into businesses where we knew the people, knew the products, and could explain in plain English how the money would come in and why it would likely keep coming. Compare that to these episodes where people are trading instruments whose behavior they can't even describe without 3 PhDs in the room. If you need a small army of quants just to feel comfortable owning something, maybe it doesn't belong in the portfolio of someone who doesn't want to die rich in theory and poor in practice. You know what the markets keep teaching and people keep forgetting. The more complex the product, the more likely it is that someone somewhere is hiding a risk you won't appreciate until it's too late. Let me ask you, if the people selling you a clever financial structure earn their big fees up front, and you bear the tail risk for the next 10 years, how do you think that story usually ends? Not with you as the hero. I remember being asked time and again, Charlie, what should we do before the next big crash? People want a tidy checklist, something they can tape on the wall next to their Bloomberg terminal. But life and markets aren't that obliging. The real answer sounds disappointingly simple. Raise your standards on what you buy, lower your reliance on borrowed money, and lengthen your time horizon to something beyond next quarter's excitement. You know what people really hate hearing? That their temperament matters more than their IQ. Let me tell you from long experience, the ability to sit still while others make fast money doing foolish things is vastly rarer than the ability to understand discounted cash flow. I've seen highly intelligent people self-destruct because they couldn't stand the discomfort of looking wrong for a while. I remember long stretches when Berkshire didn't look so clever. The market was fascinated with things we didn't understand or didn't trust, and we were content to let others play that game. You know how you survive that psychologically. You marry your sense of identity to your process, not to whatever your neighbors are bragging about this year. If your self-worth depends on beating somebody every quarter, you're going to do some very dumb things when the tide turns. Now, you might be wondering about the future, about years like 2025 or 2026, when the world seems both more sophisticated and more fragile than anything my generation grew up with. Do you really think human nature is going to be kinder to you than it was to the folks in 1929 or 1999 or 2008? The forms will change. Crypto today, some new technological miracle tomorrow, but the underlying impulses won't. People will still be greedy, still be afraid, still believe what flatters them, and still lever up at what turn out to be exactly the wrong times. You know, when I look at modern markets, with algorithmic trading, social media-driven manias, and a global audience that can stampede in or out of anything in seconds, I don't think, oh, crashes are impossible now. I think The mechanisms are faster, the feedback loops are tighter, and when things go wrong, they may go wrong even more abruptly. The signal isn't a particular gadget or platform. The signal is the same old overconfidence wearing a more fashionable suit. I remember eras when ordinary people took years to work up the courage to invest in stocks. It felt like entering a serious long-term commitment. Contrast that with periods where people are flipping assets on their phones while waiting in line for coffee, calling it investing when it's really just gambling with better graphics. Whenever ownership turns into a video game, that's not progress, that's a danger sign. You know what else is a recurring feature before the painful breaks? The belief that central banks or governments have finally learned how to keep everyone happy forever. Let me tell you, I've watched enough policymakers to know they're not omnipotent, and they're certainly not immune to political pressure. If you build your entire plan on the assumption that they will always be able to rescue you from your own recklessness, you're putting your life savings in the hands of people you've never met, whose incentives you barely understand. I remember many people who thought they were diversified because they owned a lot of different things, all of which ultimately depended on the same generous credit conditions and the same rosy scenario. When the music stopped, they discovered that what they really had was a collection of correlated bets on optimism. That's not diversification. That's cosmetic variety masking concentrated risk. You know, in my world, real diversification starts with having some assets that can survive very bad scenarios, including the ones nobody's predicting in the glossy presentations. It's less thrilling at cocktail parties to say, I own some cash and dull but durable businesses, than to brag about your latest rocket ship. But I've lived long enough to see which approach keeps the lights on, through depressions, wars, inflation, bubbles, and all the rest. Let me tell you an unglamorous truth. Missing out on some spectacular winner won't ruin you. Chasing too many spectacular winners with borrowed money just might. I remember watching plenty of folks who could correctly point to one or two great calls in their career and yet ended up broke because they couldn't resist pressing their bets. The world remembers the story about the big win. The bankruptcy court remembers the margin calls. You know what separates survivors from casualties. Again and again. A willingness to say, I don't know, and act accordingly. That means not pretending you can value every opportunity, not stretching for yield when prices make no sense, and not confusing motion with progress. Most people would rather sound smart than be safe, and markets have a way of punishing that vanity on a long enough timeline. I remember when we found really wonderful businesses at sensible prices, and it felt almost embarrassingly easy. You didn't need complicated spreadsheets. You needed common sense and patience. Now, let me ask you, if the only way you can justify a purchase is by using 10 different scenarios and heroic assumptions about growth, are you investing or just storytelling with numbers? You know, young people often ask me, what should we do when the next big storm hits? Maybe in some year like 2026. Let me turn that around. The crucial question is what you do in the years leading up to that storm. If you insist on sailing as close to the rocks as possible in calm weather, maximum leverage, minimum margin of safety, maximum faith in popular narratives, why are you surprised when a sudden gust wrecks the boat? Let me tell you, the real signal 6 months before a serious break isn't some clever indicator. It's the accumulation of everyday insanity that people gradually stop noticing. You see borrowers who should never qualify getting money thrown at them again. You see companies with no profits becoming objects of mass worship. You see professionals who once cared deeply about risk management now caring mainly about not underperforming the current fad. When that's the background noise, you don't need a prophecy, you need the courage to step back. I remember the internal feeling we had before some of the worst episodes. Not fear, but a kind of stubborn refusal to lower our standards just because the world had decided to lower its own. That can be lonely. You watch neighbors, competitors, and sometimes even friends apparently getting much richer, much faster, and your brain whispers, maybe you're the fool here. You have to answer that whisper with something stronger than envy, a philosophy built over decades, tested in bad weather. You know, people like to talk about multidisciplinary thinking as if it's a fashion. For me, it was a survival tactic. When you borrow ideas from psychology, you learn about incentives and crowd behavior. From engineering, you learn about redundancy and safety margins. From biology, you learn about ecosystems that collapse when a small stress hits an over-optimized structure. The market is just another complex system. If everything is tuned for maximum efficiency and minimum slack, don't be shocked when a minor shock cascades into something worse. Let me tell you one little habit that helped us again and again. We tried very hard not to talk ourselves into things that only looked good because everyone else was already in love with them. You know, when you feel the excitement of participating in the same story as the crowd, the new economy, the unstoppable housing market, whatever the label is this decade, you should treat that feeling as a warning, not a green light. If you can't explain to a reasonably intelligent layperson why your investment makes sense, even if the popular story fizzles out, maybe it's not such a great idea. I remember thinking, more than once, how odd it is that so many people prefer complicated failure to simple success. It sounds much more impressive to say you're using exotic derivatives, sophisticated strategies, and advanced analytics than to say you bought a good business at a reasonable price and plan to leave it alone for 20 years. But if your goal is to end up with more purchasing power, not a more glamorous vocabulary, the boring route works better. You know, if I had to give you one piece of advice for a future that may include its own version of 1929, 2000, or 2008, maybe someone will someday label it the crash of 2026 or whatever marketing name they give it. I'd say this: try very hard to be consistently not stupid instead of trying to be very clever. That means avoiding big, permanent mistakes more than chasing big, temporary triumphs. Don't put yourself in positions where a temporary shock, which you could emotionally withstand, becomes a permanent loss because you use too much borrowed money or believe too many flattering stories. Let me ask you very directly, if the market fell by half over the next year or two, would you be forced by your structure, margin, debt, promises you've made to others, to sell at precisely the worst time? If the honest answer is yes, then your real problem isn't the future crash. It's your present setup. Fix that while the sun is shining, because storms don't make appointments with you first. I remember a line attributed to an old philosopher about life being well lived when you leave the stage without too much disgrace and with some decency intact. For investing, I translate that as try to get through a lifetime in markets without blowing up yourself or the people who trusted you. If, when all is said and done, you compounded at a decent rate, paid your bills, helped your partners, and never once had to beg for mercy from your creditors. That's a fine record, no matter how many flashy bubbles you sat out. You know, when you're my age, you don't fantasize about the perfect trade. You think about the sum of all your decisions and what they say about your character. Did you stay honest when dishonesty would have been rewarded for a while? Did you stay rational when insanity paid higher commissions? Did you build something that could last for your family, your partners, maybe a few institutions that actually do some good in the world? Those are the questions that matter more than whether you managed to sell 3 months before the next crash. Let me tell you one last thing. Markets will always tempt you with shortcuts. New tools, new narratives, new data streams. There's always something that promises to spare you from the need to think clearly and behave prudently. Don't fall for it. If, in some future year you're worried about, you find yourself surrounded by people getting rich quickly on things they can't explain, remember the boring old man who told you it's better to be slightly less rich than suddenly very poor. You know, you don't have to be a genius to survive whatever version of 2026 the world throws at you. You just have to cultivate a few sturdy habits, a distrust of easy money, a respect for basic arithmetic, an appreciation for character, your own and that of the people you back, and a willingness to sit on your hands when others are jumping up and down. Do that consistently over a lifetime, and you'll look back one day, as I do, and realize that the real signal you were looking for was inside your own behavior all along.